The moment you stop reacting to their pullback, something shifts inside them. When an avoidant pulls back, the instinct for most people is to move closer, to explain, to clarify, to reassure, to ask what changed. But that reaction is exactly what confirms the avoidant's deepest fear, that closeness will cost them their autonomy. Avoidants don't crave pursuit. They crave relief from pressure. And pressure isn't just words or demands. Pressure is emotional urgency. It's the sense that someone else's stability now depends on their availability. When you chase their distance, even with good intentions, their nervous system reads it as danger. What creates the shift is not indifference, it's regulation. When you stop personalizing their pullback, you stop turning their coping mechanism into a crisis. You don't panic. You don't perform emotional labor to bring them back. You don't collapse into self-doubt or escalate into confrontation. You remain steady. That steadiness becomes a nervous system safe space because it communicates something rare to an avoidant. I am connected to you, but I am not dependent on you. That distinction matters more than reassurance ever could. This is where the power dynamic quietly dissolves. Avoidants are used to being pursued when they withdraw. That pattern reinforces their sense of control and confirms that distance equals leverage. But when you don't react, when you don't chase, punish, or plead, the familiar script breaks. Their distance no longer produces the outcome they expect. Instead of relief followed by indifference, they feel something more complex: curiosity, awareness, and sometimes discomfort. Not because you did anything to them, but because you didn't. Your calm unsettles them because it removes their ability to regulate the connection through withdrawal. They can no longer assume you'll be waiting, hovering, or emotionally on hold. And that uncertainty does something important. It invites reflection. It creates space for them to feel their own attachment impulses without being overridden by pressure. For an avoidant, craving doesn't come from being chased. It comes from sensing that connection is available, but not guaranteed. When you stop chasing their distance, you also stop abandoning yourself. You stay anchored in your own life, your own rhythm, your own emotional center. That self-containment is what makes you memorable. Not because it's strategic, but because it's rare. Most people react, few people regulate, and regulation is what signals safety to someone whose system learned early that closeness leads to overwhelm. This is the paradox avoidants live inside of. They long for connection, but they attach through safety, not intensity. When you don't chase their distance, you embody that safety. You show them that closeness doesn't have to be demanded or defended. It can simply exist, steady, respectful, and intact. And that's when something shifts inside them. Not because you tried harder, but because you finally stopped. They don't miss people who wait. They miss people who stay intact. One of the fastest ways to lose an avoidance interest is to slowly dissolve yourself in the hope of being chosen. Waiting by the phone. Reading into silence, adjusting your tone, needs, and expectations so you don't push them away. While it may feel loving, to an avoidant nervous system, it reads as enmeshment. The quiet fear that closeness will require them to carry someone else's emotional stability. Neediness, even subtle neediness, confirms the very threat they're trying to escape. Remaining whole without their validation changes everything. Wholeness is not detachment. It's not emotional distance or pretending you don't care. It's self-anchoring. You know who you are, what you feel, and what you value, whether or not they are emotionally available in a given moment. You don't outsource your worth to their attention. You don't need constant confirmation that you matter, and because of that, your presence doesn't feel heavy. It feels grounded. Avoidants are hyper-attuned to emotional dependency, often before it's ever spoken. They sense when someone is bending, shrinking, or suspending their life in anticipation of connection. That kind of waiting doesn't create longing. It creates pressure. But when you stay intact, when your life continues to move forward with or without their immediate engagement, something unfamiliar happens. They feel you as a separate, sovereign person rather than a pull on their autonomy. This is where intrigue is born, not because you're withholding or playing hard to get, but because you don't disappear when they hesitate. You don't collapse into over-accommodation. You remain emotionally honest while staying self-directed. That combination is disarming to an avoidant. It challenges their unconscious belief that intimacy always leads to loss of self. You show them that closeness doesn't require erasure, yours or theirs, and this is why they don't miss people who wait. Waiting communicates, I need you to define me. Staying intact communicates, I choose you, but I am already whole. That energy lingers because it's rare, because it's safe, and because it forces them to confront a question they usually avoid. What would it be like to choose someone who isn't asking me to save them from themselves? Presence without pressure is the most addictive energy to an avoidant. Avoidants don't fear emotion. They fear emotional extraction. They fear being cornered into feelings before their nervous system is ready to process them. That's why interrogation shuts them down. What are you feeling? Where is this going? Do you care about me or not? These questions may be reasonable, but when they come with urgency, they trigger retreat. The avoided system hears demand, not curiosity. Emotional availability without demand is different. It's a quiet, steady openness that doesn't insist on immediate reciprocity. You're willing to share what's true for you without requiring them to match it on the spot. You don't mind their silence for hidden meanings. You don't extract reassurance to soothe your own anxiety. Instead, you show up regulated, aware of your feelings, responsible for them, and unattached to forcing a particular outcome. That regulation is what creates craving, because it allows the avoidant to approach connection at their own pace without fear of consequence. There's no emotional debt being tallied, no invisible contract that says, if I open up, I owe you certainty. In your presence, emotions are invited, not demanded. And that invitation feels radically safe to someone who learned early that vulnerability came with strings attached. You don't make them responsible for your emotional equilibrium. If they're quiet, you don't spiral. If they need space, you don't punish. If they open up, you receive it without grabbing for more. This teaches their nervous system something new. That connection can be spacious, not consuming. That closeness doesn't automatically escalate into obligation. And here's the paradox. The less you demand emotional performance, the more likely they are to offer it freely. Because you've removed the threat. You've made room for genuine expression instead of compliance. Avoidants crave what feels voluntary. They attach when they feel choice. And choice only exists when pressure is absent. Presence without pressure doesn't mean tolerating emotional absence indefinitely. It means you are clear, honest, and self-respecting without being coercive. You can name what you want without chasing it. You can stay open without staying stuck. That balance is what makes you unforgettable to an avoidant. Not because you overwhelm them with emotion, but because you proved that intimacy doesn't have to cost them their freedom or you yourself. The fastest way to lose an avoidant is trying to heal them. One of the most misunderstood dynamics with avoidance is the urge to rescue. When you see their wounds, their shutdowns, their contradictions, it's easy to slip into helper mode. You listen harder, you explain them to themselves, you soften your needs because they've been through a lot. But to an avoidant nervous system, being treated like a project doesn't feel supportive. It feels invasive. It confirms their core fear that intimacy will cost them their autonomy. Avoidants crave self-direction more than reassurance. They need to feel like they are choosing connection, not being guided into it. The moment you position yourself as their therapist, their translator, or their emotional stabilizer, you unknowingly trigger their deepest defense, loss of self. Even if your care is genuine, it places them in a passive role, and passivity is intolerable to someone who learned that survival required independence. Not trying to fix them doesn't mean you lack empathy. It means you respect their agency. You don't overfunction when they underfunction. You don't carry insight they haven't asked for. You don't make their healing your responsibility. You stay emotionally available without taking ownership of their growth. That restraint is powerful because it communicates equality rather than rescue. There is also a subtle arrogance in trying to save someone, even when it's unconscious. It suggests that you know better than they do what they need, or that they can't arrive at awareness on their own. Avoidants are exquisitely sensitive to this imbalance. They may not articulate it, but they feel it immediately. And when they do, they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because being seen as unfinished activates shame and resistance. When you don't try to heal them, something unexpected happens. They feel respected rather than managed. They feel chosen, not evaluated. You relate to them as a whole adult, not a wounded child. That alone reduces their need to defend because autonomy is preserved. Choice remains intact, and connection feels less like a threat to their identity. Ironically, this is often when avoidants begin to self-reflect, not because you pushed them to, but because you didn't. Safety allows insight. Space allows ownership. When healing is no longer something being done to them, it becomes something they may eventually choose for themselves, and that choice carries weight precisely because it wasn't coerced. Nothing stays with them like someone who leaves clean. Most people leave avoidance in one of two ways, with protest or with punishment. There are ultimatums disguised as honesty, silence disguised as strength, emotional withdrawal, meant to provoke regret. While these reactions are understandable, they keep the dynamic emotionally charged, and avoidants are skilled at escaping charge. They shut down, detach, and justify the exit as proof that closeness is unsafe. Walking away without punishing is different. It's quiet, grounded, self-respecting. There are no threats, no emotional debt, no unspoken contracts that say, you'll regret this. You don't linger to be understood. You don't stay to extract closure. You simply recognize misalignment and remove yourself without trying to control how they feel about it. This kind of exit is rare, and rarity is what creates impact. A clean departure disrupts the avoidance usual narrative. There's no drama to dismiss, no volatility to point to as justification, no chaos to regulate against. Instead, there is clarity, and clarity is uncomfortable because it removes distraction. When you leave clean, you return responsibility to them. You don't make them wrong. You don't make yourself the victim. You don't carry resentment forward in the hope they'll sense it. You let the truth stand on its own. This no longer works for me. That statement, when backed by action, forces awareness. Not immediately, not always consciously, but it lingers. Avoidants are often less affected by what's said and more affected by what's consistent. A self-respecting exit communicates something words never could, that you value connection, but not at the expense of yourself, that you are capable of intimacy and capable of walking away when intimacy isn't reciprocated. That combination creates attachment tension, not panic, not obsession, tension. Attachment tension arises when someone feels the absence of a dynamic that was safe but not consuming. When there's no emotional chaos to distract from the loss becomes clearer. And clarity invites reflection. Many avoidants don't process the impact of a clean exit until later, when the nervous system is calm enough to feel it. This is why nothing stays with them like someone who leaves without punishment, because it contradicts their expectations, because it challenges their defenses, and because it leaves behind a quiet truth they can't easily dismiss. I wasn't abandoned. I was respected, and I chose not to meet it. Walking away clean is not about strategy. It's about integrity. It's about refusing to abandon yourself in protest or in silence. And whether or not they ever come back, that kind of exit changes the dynamic permanently, because it restores balance. And balance is what avoidants secretly crave, even when they don't know how to ask for it. You don't convince an avoidant to value you. You let them discover it. One of the most subtle traps people fall into with avoidance is trying to be understood. You explain your intentions. You clarify your tone. You justify your needs so they don't feel like demands. You package your worth in logic and empathy, hoping that if they just see you clearly enough, they'll finally choose you fully. But to an avoidant nervous system, over-explaining doesn't feel clarifying. It feels like pressure. Over-justifying creates an invisible weight. It communicates that your value needs translation, defense, or persuasion. And the moment worth becomes something that has to be argued for, the dynamic shifts. Avoidants don't respond to emotional persuasion the way secure people do. They don't soften into it. They pull away from it. Because persuasion implies expectation, and expectation implies obligation. Clarity without persuasion is different. It's stating what's true without trying to control how it lands. You don't over-contextualize your feelings so they'll be more palatable. You don't shrink your needs into something reasonable enough to accept. You speak plainly, calmly, and then you stop. You allow silence. You allow them to respond or not without filling the space with self-defense. That restraint reads as confidence, not arrogance, not coldness. Confidence rooted in self-trust. You're not waiting for them to validate your experience. You already have. And because of that, your words carry more weight. Avoidants crave what doesn't need to be sold because it signals internal authority. It tells their nervous system, this explains itself. This doesn't need convincing. There is also something deeply regulating about someone who doesn't plead their case, someone who knows their value well enough to let it be discovered through consistency rather than argument. Avoidants are slow processors of emotional information. They integrate meaning over time through pattern, not persuasion. When you stop over-explaining, you give them the space to notice you instead of resisting you. And paradoxically, this is often when they begin to value you more, not because you said more, but because you trusted that what you offered was enough. You didn't chase understanding, you embodied it. And embodiment is what lingers. Boundaries feel safer than emotional volatility to an avoidant. Avoidants are not afraid of boundaries. They're afraid of emotional unpredictability, raised voices, sudden ultimatums, silent resentment, emotional collapses, followed by closeness demands. Volatility keeps their nervous system on high alert. And when that happens, their instinct is to disengage. Holding boundaries without anger creates a different experience. You don't explode when something crosses a line. You don't collapse into self-blame. You don't threaten or withdraw affection to regain control. You simply name what you accept and what you don't, calmly, consistently, and without drama. The steadiness is profoundly disarming to an avoidant because it contradicts their internal model of conflict. Many avoidants learned early that expressing needs led to emotional chaos or loss of connection. So they adapted by suppressing, distancing, or minimizing. When you hold a boundary without emotional charge, you show them a new possibility that limits can exist without punishment. You also remove the need for them to manage your emotions. You are not asking them to fix your feelings. You are not escalating in the hope they'll respond. You take responsibility for enforcing your own limits through action rather than emotional intensity. That autonomy is what allows them to stay present instead of fleeing. Consistency is the key here. Anyone can set a boundary once. What's rare is someone who holds it without resentment, without repeated explanations, and without emotional leverage. You don't argue your boundary into existence. You live it. And that lived consistency becomes something avoidants respect even when they don't like it. Over time, this creates safety. Not the kind that soothes immediately, but the kind that stabilizes slowly. They learn that your boundaries are not threats, they're information. They don't have to guess where they stand. They don't have to brace for emotional fallout. Your reactions are proportionate, predictable, and self-contained. This is why boundaries without anger are memorable. They don't overwhelm the avoidance system. They don't invite shutdown. They invite choice. And choice is the foundation of attachment for someone who fears entrapment. When you combine not over-explaining your worth with holding boundaries calmly, you create a powerful signal. I know who I am, and I will not abandon myself to be chosen. That signal doesn't provoke panic. It provokes respect. And respect is often the bridge avoidants need before they can even begin to feel desire. Not because you demanded it, not because you convinced them, but because your presence was clear, steady, and intact. What you tolerate teaches them how little effort is required. Hot and cold behavior is one of the most confusing dynamics with avoidance. One moment there is warmth, presence, even intimacy. The next, distance, silence, or emotional withdrawal. Many people respond by over-investing during the cold phases and accepting crumbs during the warm ones, grateful for any return of closeness. But this pattern doesn't create attachment. It trains it. And what it trains is inconsistency. Avoidants don't crave chaos, they crave regulation. But when inconsistency is met with immediate access, reassurance, or emotional availability, the nervous system learns that presence isn't required for connection. Distance becomes cost-free. There's no internal motivation to stabilize when the bond remains intact, regardless of behavior. In that dynamic, the avoidant never has to fully arrive because arrival isn't necessary to be received. Not rewarding hot and cold behavior doesn't mean punishing it. It means not over-functioning in response to it. You don't rush in to reestablish closeness the moment they resurface. You don't pretend nothing happened just to keep the peace. You don't emotionally reset the relationship every time they disengage. Instead, you respond proportionately. Warmth meets warmth. Distance meets space. Consistency meets access. This recalibration is subtle but powerful. Emotional access is no longer automatic. It becomes contingent on presence, not perfection, not intensity, but showing up. And when connection requires intention, something shifts inside the avoidant. They begin to associate closeness with choice rather than default, with effort rather than entitlement. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional economics. They notice when someone is always available regardless of behavior. And while that availability may feel comforting at first, it eventually dulls desire, because desire needs contrast. It needs agency. It needs the sense that connection is alive, something you step into, not something that waits indefinitely. When you stop rewarding inconsistency, you also stop betraying yourself. You no longer override your own nervous system to accommodate theirs. You allow your reactions to reflect reality. If they disappear, you don't perform emotional loyalty in their absence. You stay in your light. You stay in your center. That self-respect is felt, even if it's never acknowledged out loud. Over time, this creates a new internal association for the avoidant. If I want closeness, I have to be present. Not perfectly, not constantly, but intentionally. And intention is what transforms intermittent attachment into something more stable. Not because you demanded consistency, but because you modeled it. They attach when they realize you didn't shrink to keep them. At the core of every avoidant dynamic is a quiet test, often unconscious. Will you give yourself up to stay connected to me? Most people fail this test without realizing it. They become more available than they want to be, more understanding than they feel, more flexible than is healthy. They minimize their needs, soften their boundaries, and tell themselves it's love. But what it really is self-abandonment. Avoidance. Don't attach to self-erasure. They feel relieved by it temporarily because it reduces pressure. But relief is not desire, and it's not attachment. Over time, self-erasure confirms their belief that closeness requires imbalance, that one person must disappear for the other to remain comfortable. And that belief makes true intimacy impossible. Not abandoning yourself to be chosen is the most counterintuitive thing you can do with an avoidant. You don't inflate their importance at the expense of your own life. You don't become over-available to prove you're safe. You don't emotionally perform in the hope of being prioritized. You remain grounded, chosen or not. This groundedness shows up in small, consistent ways. You honor your time. You keep your routines. You say no when something doesn't work for you. You express needs without apologizing for having them. You don't chase reassurance when uncertainty appears. And most importantly, you don't threaten your own integrity to preserve connection. That's the moment craving begins to form, because you stop being something they can unconsciously lean against. You become someone they have to consciously choose. And choice is the bridge between safety and desire for an avoidant. When they realize you didn't shrink to keep them, it destabilizes an old pattern. They expect people to bend, to adapt, to slowly disappear. When that doesn't happen, curiosity replaces complacency, respect replaces assumption. And sometimes, not always, but often, attachment begins to emerge. This is not because you withheld love. It's because you embodied it without losing yourself. You showed them that intimacy doesn't require sacrifice of identity. That connection can exist between two whole people, not one orbiting the other. Craving for an avoidant is not hunger for attention. It's longing for a dynamic that feels safe and self-respecting. When you don't abandon yourself, you represent that possibility. Even if they can't fully step into it yet, they feel it. And what they feel stays with them. This is the truth most people miss. Avoidants don't attach to people who try harder. They attach to people who stay intact, who don't reward inconsistency, who don't erase themselves for closeness, who don't collapse when uncertainty appears. That's when the nervous system recalibrates. That's when desire deepens. And that's when craving forms, not because you chased it, but because you finally refuse to abandon yourself to be chosen. They don't crave you because you try harder, they crave you because you don't. This is the truth that sits underneath every avoidant dynamic. Even when it's hard to accept, craving does not form from effort, explanation, or emotional endurance. It doesn't come from being more patient, more understanding, more available than you already are. For avoidance, pursuit doesn't feel like love, it feels like pressure. And pressure activates distance, not attachment. Avoidants don't attach through being chased. They attach through safety, respect, and self-containment. Safety is not silence or compliance. It's emotional regulation. It's knowing that connection with you won't overwhelm their nervous system. Respect is not admiration or accommodation. It's equality. It's being met by someone who does not collapse, plead, or perform to be chosen. And self-containment is the foundation of both, the ability to stay emotionally intact regardless of outcome. When you try harder, you unknowingly shift the balance. You begin carrying the emotional weight of the connection alone. You explain more. You wait longer. You accept less. And while this may feel like devotion to an avoidant, it signals imbalance. It suggests that closeness requires one person to overextend while the other remains protected. That dynamic might maintain contact, but it kills desire. But staying whole does the opposite. It communicates that you value connection, but not at the expense of yourself. That you can be open without being needy, clear without being controlling, available without being overexposed. This balance is what allows an avoidant to feel drawn in rather than cornered, because your presence doesn't ask them to give up their autonomy. It invites them to bring it into connection. You were never meant to chase someone into choosing you. Chasing creates anxiety on one side and avoidance on the other. It turns love into a performance and attachment into a negotiation. And over time, it erodes your sense of self. What avoidants crave, even if they don't consciously know it, is someone who remains steady. Someone who doesn't disappear emotionally when closeness wavers, but also doesn't abandon themselves to preserve it. Staying whole is not a tactic. It's an orientation. It's choosing to remain connected to your own values, rhythms, and needs, regardless of how another person shows up. It's allowing yourself to feel care without turning that care into self-sacrifice. It's being willing to walk away without resentment when alignment isn't there. And that willingness changes the entire emotional field. When an avoidant encounters someone who stays whole, something unfamiliar happens. The usual defenses don't activate in the same way. There's no urgency to pull away because there's no pressure to perform. There's no need to assert independence through distance because independence is already respected in that environment. Desire has room to breathe. This is why they don't crave you, because you try harder. They crave you because you don't, because you stop chasing clarity, because you stop negotiating your worth. Because you stop proving your patience. And in that stopping, you become grounded, present, unmoved by uncertainty, but open to connection. Whether or not an avoidant ever chooses you fully is not something you can control. But what you can control is whether you abandon yourself in the process. And that choice matters more than any outcome. Because staying whole protects your integrity. It keeps your nervous system regulated, and it ensures that any connection you build with an avoidant or anyone else is rooted in mutual respect rather than emotional survival. This is the closing truth. The moment you stop trying to be chosen and start choosing yourself, the dynamic shifts. Not always in the way you expect, not always in the way you hope, but always in a way that restores balance. You were never meant to chase them. You are meant to stay whole and let that wholeness be felt.